For 15 years, every morning was a reminder of the newspapers his younger brother Leo never got to deliver. Ethan adjusted his reporter's tie, the crisp paper in his own hands feeling like a cruel irony. The official story was a runaway, a theory Ethan never bought. Then a call from the old neighborhood shatters the stagnant silence. A beagle named Copper, known for digging, had unearthed a faded green helmet from a backyard on Leo's old route, the same helmet he wore on his last ride. This story is a difficult one, and it makes you wonder what you might do when pushed to the absolute edge. I'm curious to hear what you think about the choices made, so stick around to the end and share your thoughts in the comments. The phone felt unnaturally heavy in Ethan's hand. He stared out the window of his high-rise apartment, the bustling city below a blur of yellow cabs and hurried pedestrians. It was a world away from Northwood Creek, the quiet suburban town where he grew up. The town he had run from the first chance he got. He had built a new life here, a successful career as an investigative journalist, all fueled by a single, burning question that had defined his entire adult life. What happened to Leo? His brother was 13, all lanky limbs and a goofy smile, with a stubborn cowlick that refused to be tamed. He'd been so proud of his paper route, his first real job. He'd saved up for that mountain bike for 6 months, and the lime green helmet was a non-negotiable part of the deal from their mom. Ethan, then a know-it-all 17-year-old, had teased him about it, calling him a safety nerd. It was one of 1,000 small, cruel memories that ambushed him in the quiet moments. The voice on the phone belonged to Mrs. Gable, their old neighbor. Her voice, usually warm and full of laughter, was thin and shaky. "Ethan, honey, you need to come home," she'd said. She explained how her beagle, Copper, a creature of relentless energy and curiosity, had been digging near the fence she shared with the old Miller property. He'd unearthed something. At first she thought it was just an old plastic bowl, but when she washed the caked dirt off, the color was unmistakable. Lime green. "The police are here," she'd whispered, "but I wanted to call you first." Ethan didn't remember the drive. It was a 3-hour stretch of highway that passed in a fog of screeching tires and his brother's fading smile. 15 years of dead ends, of his parents' hope slowly curdling into resigned grief, of police officers patting his shoulder and saying, "Sometimes kids just run, son." But Leo wouldn't have run. Not without his bike. Not without his savings. Not without leaving his helmet behind. When he pulled onto his old street, the flashing lights of a single police cruiser outside Mrs. Gable's house felt like a beacon in the twilight. Northwood Creek looked smaller, the trees taller, the houses a little more worn. It was a place frozen in time, and he was the ghost who had finally come back to haunt it. Mrs. Gable hugged him tightly on her porch, her small frame trembling. Inside, a young, tired-looking officer named Price was bagging the helmet. It was scratched and faded, a web of fine cracks running through the plastic, but it was Leo's. Ethan would know it anywhere. "We're logging it as evidence," Officer Price said, his tone professionally detached. "But honestly, Mr. Hayes, after all this time, it's probably nothing. Kids lose things." "He didn't lose this," Ethan said, his voice hard. "This helmet was a part of him. Where exactly did the dog find it?" Mrs. Gable led him to her backyard. The fence separating her yard from the next was old and wooden. On the other side was the former Miller house, a modest 2-story home that now looked neglected, a "for rent" sign hammered into its overgrown lawn. Copper, the beagle, sat proudly beside a freshly dug hole, his tail thumping a happy rhythm against the grass. The hole was right against the fence line, in the shadow of a large, gnarled oak tree. "Who are the Millers?" Ethan asked, even though he remembered them. A quiet, almost invisible couple, Arthur and Doris. He couldn't recall ever having a real conversation with them. They were just there. "Oh, they were strange," Mrs. Gable said, lowering her voice. "Kept to themselves. Doris was always sick. Arthur lost his job at the factory around the time, well, you know. They sold the house and moved away maybe 10 years back. Never heard from them again." The officer shrugged. "We'll run their names, see if they have any priors, but it's a long shot. The case is cold." Ethan knew what cold meant. it meant it would sit in a box, a forgotten file number. The discovery of the helmet would be a footnote, not a new chapter. As he watched the officer drive away, the green helmet sitting on the passenger seat, a cold resolve settled in his gut. The police might be done, but he was just getting started. He was a reporter. His job was to find the truth, to connect the dots nobody else could see. This time, the story wasn't for a headline. It was for Leo. His parents were in Florida, having finally retired and sold the family home a few years prior. He called them, breaking the news as gently as he could. The conversation was stilted, full of painful pauses. The hope he felt was a fragile thing, and he knew that for them, it might be more cruel than comforting. He checked into the only motel in town, the musty room a stark contrast to a city apartment. He opened his laptop, the familiar glow a small comfort in the dark. The police might have the helmet, but he had the story, and the first characters were Arthur and Doris Miller. Using the skills he'd honed over years of chasing down leads, Ethan started digging. It didn't take long. Public records were a breadcrumb trail for those who knew how to follow them. He found the deed of sale for their old house. He found a forwarding address, then another. They had moved twice since leaving Northwood Creek. Their current residence was in a place called Harmony Springs, a small, struggling town 3 hours west. But it was the next discovery that made the hair on his arm stand up. He cross-referenced local news archives from 15 years ago with public financial records. Just as Mrs. Gable had said, Arthur Miller had been laid off from the town's main manufacturing plant 6 months before Leo disappeared. A month after the layoff, the bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings on their home. The Millers had been on the verge of losing everything. Suddenly, they weren't just a quiet, reclusive couple. They were a desperate one. And desperation, Ethan knew better than anyone, was the most powerful motive in the world. The official runaway theory had never made sense. But a kidnapping for ransom, one that had gone horribly, terribly wrong, that made a chilling kind of sense. The Millers wouldn't have been asking for $1 million. They would have been asking for just enough to save their home, a sum a middle-class family like his might have been able to scrape together. The next morning, Ethan didn't drive back to the city. He drove west toward Harmony Springs. He needed to look these people in the eye. He needed to see if the guilt of what they'd done was still etched on their faces. As he drove, he rehearsed his approach. He wouldn't be Ethan Hayes, the grieving older brother. He would be Ethan Hayes, a journalist doing a follow-up story on the economic impact of the factory closure in Northwood Creek. It was a plausible cover, a way to get inside without showing his hand. Harmony Springs was even more depressed than he'd imagined. Main Street was a collection of boarded-up storefronts and peeling paint. The Miller's address led him to a small, dilapidated bungalow at the edge of town. The yard was patchy, and the porch sagged. It was the kind of place people disappeared into. He took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and knocked on the door. After a long moment, it creaked open. A thin, stooped man with watery blue eyes peered out at him. He looked smaller and older than the vague memory Ethan had of him, worn down by time and hardship. "Arthur Miller?" Ethan asked, offering a practiced, friendly smile. "Who's asking?" The man's voice was a dry rasp. "My name is Ethan Hayes. I'm a reporter," he began, launching into his cover story. "I'm writing a piece about the families affected by the Northwood plant closure 15 years ago. I was hoping you might share your story." Arthur hesitated, his eyes full of suspicion. But then a woman's voice called from inside. "Artie? Who is it?" Doris Miller appeared behind her husband. She was frail, her skin almost translucent, and she leaned heavily on a walker. When she saw Ethan, a flicker of something unreadable passed through her eyes. Not recognition, but something else. Fear. "A reporter," Arthur grunted. "About the old plant." "Oh," Doris said softly. "Well, I suppose it couldn't hurt to talk. Come in, dear. Don't mind the mess." The inside of the house was cluttered and smelled of dust and old medicine. Ethan sat on a lumpy floral sofa as Arthur and Doris settled into matching armchairs. He started with easy questions about their life in Northwood Creek, about the factory, about the difficulty of starting over. Arthur gave short, clipped answers, while Doris just stared at her hands, which she twisted nervously in her lap. Ethan carefully guided the conversation, painting a picture of the town at that specific time 15 years ago. He mentioned how tough things were for everyone. He talked about the community, the neighborhood. Then, as casually as he could manage, he played his first card. I remember there was a lot going on that year, he said, watching them both. There was that tragedy, too, that young paperboy who went missing. Leo Hayes. Did you know the family? The reaction was instantaneous. Arthur's face hardened into a stone mask, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the arms of his chair. But it was Doris who gave them away. A tiny choked sob escaped her lips, and her whole body seemed to shrink. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that was 15 years old. We didn't know them, Arthur said, his voice dangerously low. We kept to ourselves. This interview is over. You need to leave. Ethan stood up slowly. He knew he had them. The fear was radiating off them in waves. He decided to play his final card. I understand, he said, his voice quiet but firm. It's just a strange coincidence. The reason I thought of it was because a dog just dug up his old bicycle helmet in your old backyard. He watched the last bit of color drain from Doris Miller's face. Her eyes rolled back in her head and she slumped sideways in her chair, unconscious. Arthur shot to his feet with a strangled cry, not of anger, but of pure, unadulterated panic. The carefully constructed wall of silence they had built around themselves for 15 years had just crumbled to dust. Arthur scrambled to his wife's side, fumbling to check her pulse, his hands shaking violently. Doris, wake up, he pleaded. Ethan pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his own heart hammering against his ribs. As he reported a medical emergency, his eyes never left Arthur's face. The man was trapped, a cornered animal, and in his terrified eyes, Ethan saw the confirmation of a truth he had sought for half his life. Paramedics arrived within minutes, their efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos of the small, cluttered room. As they worked on Doris, fitting an oxygen mask to her face and checking her vitals, Arthur stood by helplessly, muttering under his breath. The local police arrived, a single officer who looked barely old enough to shave. Ethan explained who he was, leaving out the part about being Leo's brother for now. He was simply a reporter who had been interviewing the couple when the woman fainted, but as the paramedics prepared to transport Doris to the hospital, she began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open and fixed on her husband. Artie, she whispered, her voice weak and reedy. We have to tell him. Be quiet, Doris, Arthur hissed, his face pale with sweat. You're not well. No, she insisted, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. I can't. Not anymore. 15 years. And then it all came pouring out. It wasn't a neat, orderly confession. It was a torrent of guilt and fear. A story that had been dammed up for a decade and a half. The officer stood frozen, his hand hovering over his notepad, as Doris confessed to a crime he was too young to remember. She told him about the foreclosure notice, the shame, the crushing weight of failure. The idea had started as a whisper, a desperate, foolish fantasy, a kidnapping. They saw Leo every morning on his bike, a reliable, predictable target. They didn't want to hurt him, she sobbed. They just wanted the money, a few $1,000s to pay the bank. They thought his parents would pay it quickly, quietly, and then they would let him go, and no one would ever know. On that Tuesday morning, they had been waiting. Arthur had called Leo over to the porch, pretending to have a complaint about a wet newspaper. When Leo got close, Arthur grabbed him. But they hadn't counted on Leo fighting back. He was a skinny kid, but he was strong. He kicked and yelled. He bit Arthur's hand. In the struggle, as Arthur tried to pull him inside, Leo tripped on the top step and fell backward. Doris's voice broke completely. His head, it hit the concrete. There was so much. It wasn't supposed to happen. He just went still. Panic had consumed them. They were no longer kidnappers. They were killers. They dragged Leo's body into their garage and hid it under a tarp. That night, under the cover of darkness, Arthur dug a hole in the backyard in the soft earth of Doris's prize flower bed. They buried Leo there, along with his bicycle, which they had dragged from the curb. The helmet was an afterthought. They panicked and buried it in a separate, shallow hole near the fence, thinking if it was ever found, it wouldn't lead anyone to the body. They never made the ransom call. They simply boarded up their windows and their lives, waiting. When the police searches finally ended, when the news stories faded, when the world seemed to accept that Leo Hayes was just another runaway, they sold the house for a loss and fled. They had been running ever since, not from the law, but from the ghost of a 13-year-old boy in a lime green helmet. As Doris was wheeled out on a stretcher, still weeping, Arthur Miller sank into his armchair, a broken man. He didn't resist when the young officer, his hand now trembling slightly, recited his rights and placed him in handcuffs. Ethan stood in the doorway, the confession he had recorded on his phone a heavy weight in his pocket. He had the truth. He had the whole, ugly, pathetic story. But it brought him no satisfaction, only a profound and hollow sadness. He called Detective Price in Northwood Creek and told him everything. This time, there was no detachment in the officer's voice. An excavation was arranged. A few days later, Ethan stood behind the yellow police tape that now cordoned off the Millers' old house, watching as forensic investigators carefully unearthed a small, rusted mountain bike, and then the remains of a boy who should have been a man. Ethan wrote the story. It was the hardest thing he had ever written. He didn't write it as a journalist hunting a scoop, but as a brother saying goodbye. He wrote about Leo's goofy smile and his ridiculous cowlick, about his pride in his first job, about the green helmet he never took off. He wrote about the quiet, desperate couple who had made a terrible choice, and the tragic, senseless accident that had stolen his brother's future. After the funeral, after the media had moved on to the next tragedy, Ethan and his parents stood in the Northwood Creek Cemetery. It was a quiet, sunny afternoon. For the first time in 15 years, they had a place to lay their flowers. The questions were gone. The gnawing uncertainty that had been a constant member of their family had finally been laid to rest, right there, beside Leo. The grief would never leave. Ethan knew that. But the haunting was over. He had finally brought his brother home. The Millers weren't evil masterminds. They were ordinary people crushed by desperation who made a choice with unimaginable consequences. So here's what I'd like to ask you. Do you think extreme circumstances can make good people do terrible things, or does it only reveal what was inside them all along? I truly appreciate you listening to this story. If it made you think, please consider liking it and subscribing for more stories that explore the difficult questions of life. Your support means the world.